Dave with queen nine off. He's been splashing around quite a bit, and he's reaching for some chips. He'll call the 100.
In the video you just watched, the player limped in with queen nine off suit. As he did this, he had a lot of unnecessary arm and hand movements. Then he double-checked his cards, which was followed by him moving around in the seat. Let's watch this clip again. If this player had decided to limp with a premium hand like queens, kings, or aces, it's likely he'd be more thoughtful and focused. He'd also have an instinct to be more inconspicuous and to not draw attention to himself. In general, unnecessary, ostentatious physical movements by non-aggressors will tend to indicate weaker hands. Other videos in this series examined how talking from non-aggressors generally makes strong hands unlikely. As it turns out, pretty much any ostentatious behavior from a non-aggressor, no matter if it's physical or verbal, will tend to make the strongest hands unlikely. In this video, we'll focus on some ostentatious physical behaviors from checkers and callers and see how they're associated with weaker hands. What do I mean by ostentatious behavior? This is a subjective term, but as a rough definition, let's say that ostentatious behavior is any behavior that isn't necessary and that could easily attract attention. Some examples of ostentatious behavior are unnecessary or exaggerated motions of the hands or arms, unusual facial expressions, placing chips forcefully into the pot, putting down a chip or a card protector very hard on cards, reaching for chips out of turn, double-checking whole cards ostentatiously, shuffling cards, looking intently or staring at the player whose turn it is to act, smiling or laughing, talking or joking, loud announcements of call or check, abnormally long pauses before checking or calling. Some of these, like smiling and laughing, talking, and defensive staring, have been covered in other videos in this series. In this video, we'll be focusing on physical movements. What are the reasons for this pattern? Players with strong hands have more reason to be focused on the situation, focused on how they're going to play the hand, and focused on what their opponents are doing. This focus makes it likely that players with strong hands will be more thoughtful and stoic, and less likely to engage in unusual behavior. Non-aggressors with very strong hands can also have a tendency to avoid drawing attention to themselves. They may have an instinct to set a trap and hide from their opponents. They don't want to be studied, and they don't want to set up an obstacle to action. For both of these reasons, most ostentatious behavior from non-aggressors tends to happen when the non-aggressor has a weaker hand and is either unfocused or feeling defensive. What's the main practical use of spotting such patterns? Here are a few common situations where spotting such behavior may come in handy. You notice a player limp in early position and then do something ostentatious. This can encourage you to raise light. In some games where players like to limp early with aces or kings, this behavior can make you less concerned that the player is slow playing aces or kings and waiting for a raise. A player in front of you raises and a player behind you is doing something ostentatious, which reduces his potential threat to you. This might encourage you to call the raise or 3-bet when you might have otherwise folded. Post-flop, your opponent does something ostentatious when it's still your turn to act. This might encourage you to bluff. An opponent calls your flop or turn bluff ostentatiously, which may encourage you to continue bluffing. These small clues can be used to make up your mind in borderline spots where you could easily go either way on a decision. They will generally not be big game changers, but they can help you make better decisions in a good amount of situations where your decision could easily go one of 2 or even 3 directions. Now let's look at some examples of various kinds of ostentatious motions and gestures. We'll start with some pre-flop examples and move on to some post-flop situations. In this next hand, we'll be looking at this player, Chris, who's waiting for the player in front of him to act. As the player in front was thinking, Chris put his chip on his cards with a lot of force, making a slapping sound. Let's watch that moment again. If Chris had a strong hand like queens, kings, or aces, he'd probably not draw attention to himself in this way, either with the slam of his chip or by putting his chip on his cards, announcing his interest in the hand. If you were the player in front of him, this is a valuable clue that you don't have to be too worried about Chris. This can occasionally be of interest when you are in late position and see a player or two doing something like this behind you. With less to fear from a player behind you, it can encourage you to call an existing raise or encourage you to raise yourself. In this hand, Chris limped in. If you were a player to act after him, Chris's behavior means you wouldn't have to worry much about him having a strong hand. This might encourage you to raise light. In this next hand from a tournament, we'll watch as this player, Mike K, limps under the gun and has a couple ostentatious behaviors. The ostentatious behaviors were double checking his cards and moving his hands around a lot. Let's watch this again. Similar to the last hand, if this player had decided to limp with a premium hand, I'd predict he would be more stoic and calm in his demeanor, and not be doing these things that could draw attention to himself. Double checking cards soon after first looking at them is unnecessary behavior and a bit ostentatious. Players with strong hands generally don't like to look at their cards for long or look back at them repeatedly, just out of an instinct to avoid attracting attention. Again, there are a lot of decent hands this player could still be doing this with. The ostentatious behavior from a caller will mainly serve to make aces, kings, and queens unlikely. Considering that a lot of players are capable of limping early with aces or kings, being able to discount that possibility can sometimes be very useful. This next hand is from a 1-2 cash game. We'll be watching this player, Bill R., who's waiting for action and who makes it pretty obvious he's not going to be much of a threat in the hand. There's been a button straddle for $5, and Bill R. limped in the small blind. We'll pick up the action when it comes around to late position.
Distant cousin.
13 this time.
Raise the 13 from Pat.
Stuck myself out.
Call us 13.
I throw $13 away.
These games are starting.
Did you notice how Bill R. was playing with his chips and seeming to assemble his chips before it was his turn to act? This makes it very unlikely he's got a strong hand. This could be valuable information if you were the straddle and were worried that Bill R. might have limped first to act with a strong hand. This next hand is from a tournament. We'll be watching this player, Lloyd, as he calls a raise with 9-8 offsuit. Watch for any unnecessary movements.
Chris Moneymaker, never one to disappoint. He opens it up with ace-6 off. Nicky numbers, ace-queen.
Lloyd moves around a lot, throws in his chips rather forcefully, looks towards the razor, arches his eyebrows, and taps his finger on his arm. And he continues to move around a bit as he follows the action. Let's watch it again. Now let's watch a comparison hand where the same player again just calls a raise from Moneymaker, but this time he has pocket aces.
We should continue to see some very good action at this table. And Chris looks like he's putting those chips to good use immediately. He opens to 6 1/4, min +1. And right behind him, Lloyd Mandel, pocket aces. And he takes a page out of Chris's book. He just makes the call. This is not creative editing, folks.
While he had some small movements, he was much more physically restrained. He doesn't have nearly as much movement, and he places his call in much more gently. After he calls, he sits completely still. Let's watch it one more time. These last two hand comparisons are nice to have because they show the exact same situation with different hand strengths, and they show the key point I'm trying to make with this video.